get into the numbers. Not only that, we're going to do a bit of an analysis of that as to what options are available on that front, but we'll also bring our audience, give them some insights into some initiatives that are being contemplated currently to try and mitigate, the impact that mismanagement at times of these coalitions has presented itself. It has had dire consequences for the economies of some of these metros, where political infighting has been the order of the day, resulting, of course, in disaster for the people of those metros. I'll be taking you through that conversation and those initiatives in a while. Before we do that, let's get to the numbers first, just where things are as we speak. Amil Umral is my colleague from our research department. Amil, take us through the big numbers first. How many votes have been calculated, what percentage of the votes have results coming on as things stand, and then we'll take it from there. How are we looking at this particular point? 6:15, how are things looking?
Well, we're obviously one day after elections have been concluded. 47% of votes have been tallied already, and from those votes we see that the ANC is leading the pack with about 46.7% of total votes headed to that party, followed then by the DA with 22.57% and the EFF with 9.86%. Let's get into the provinces now. Starting at the DA's home province, we would call it in the Western Cape. Obviously not surprising, the DA with the bulk of the votes in the Western Cape, 52.56%, followed by the ANC with a fifth of the votes, and other parties, much smaller ones, almost about 10% there. Let's head back as we move in to the Eastern Cape. So the Eastern Cape, again, the ANC leading quite substantially there with 67.72% of the votes, the DA with almost 13%, and the EFF trying to get onto that 10% of the votes in the Eastern Cape. But while we're at the Eastern Cape here, let's talk very quickly about Nelson Mandela Bay. What's surprising here is that the ANC has dropped below 50%, as we saw in 2016, opening up for coalitions if this trend does continue. The ANC has got 42.72% of the vote so far. The DA with right on their tail, actually, with 37%. And the EFF, who looks to be another kingmaker, perhaps in this metro, at 7.34% there. Let's head back as we go into KwaZulu-Natal. KwaZulu-Natal, again, we see the ANC dominating with 43.58%. Obviously not as much as they would have liked to at this point, with the IFP chasing closely behind at 28%, and the EFF again sitting in third place.
And I see it's only 35%.
Yeah, 35% through. So we've still got quite a lot of way to go.
Still, yes, and it's a vast province.
Of course, and if we want to
largely rural,
go into eThekwini, for example, as we see, only 8% of the votes have come in from eThekwini. So how far we can take the projections when it comes to these figures that we see here remain to be seen, obviously. But as we see, the DA is almost at that 50%, and the ANC is almost at the 50% barrier, with the DA and the EFF following them there. Let us move on to the Northern Cape. And I think it's not going to be much of a surprise here. With almost all the votes in the Northern Cape, we see the ANC dominating. I'm pretty sure, as projections do show, that they're going to cross that 50% barrier and hold most of the councils in the province.
Now, Amel, just in the interest of time, I know it's going to be similar situations across all the other provinces, but for the purposes of the discussion I'm about to have in a short while, I just want us to, then you did show us the Nelson Mandela Metro, but I want us to go to the 3 Gauteng metros, because between the 3 of them and Nelson Mandela Bay, these are the most hotly contested metros, and this is where the conversations around possible coalitions are in fact beginning to take place, as you would have heard also from the 2 senior officials of the DA and the ANC that Sophie Mokoena spoke to a short while ago. How is Tshwane, Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni looking?
So we'll start looking at the CSIR's projections, and these are their latest projections. And we'll start with the city of Johannesburg. And just to give you a bit of a throw forward, as the CSIR is projecting, all three of these metros in Gauteng will be hung and will have to be looking into coalition. So in Johannesburg, for example, they're projecting 35% for the ANC and very closely behind 30% for the DA, with the EFF at 11.6 and a bunch of smaller parties then coming afterwards. But Action SA here, interestingly, projecting at 11.4%, just as much almost as the EFF. So they've gained quite a lot, we could say, in Gauteng. Moving on to Ekurhuleni, we've got the ANC again dropping below 50%, projecting at 38.3% here, with the DA at 29.4%. The EFF at 12.8%, and the Action SA at 7.2%. So we can argue here that the EFF, Action SA, and other smaller parties will become kingmakers in these metros. Going on to Tshwane, we've got the ANC and the DA very closely projected at 33%, the EFF at 11%, and Action SA again at 7.2%. So very similar trends across all the metros in Gauteng.
It's going to be very interesting because that CSIR model has actually proved to be fairly accurate over the years. So even though the numbers are still low, generally speaking, but even with those small numbers, they have been fairly accurate in the past in their projections, which is now going to bring us to the next conversation. Thanks very much, Amil, that we are going to have with Terry Tselane, who in the past has penned, some like really interesting thoughts around these coalitions, their management, and what actually, our experiences of the past 5 years especially has actually meant. Looking at the numbers, as I was saying to Amil, even though they are still low, generally speaking, we haven't even gotten to the halfway mark. But the CSIR the predictions have been fairly accurate in the past. And if there are anything to go by, it looks set that we're going to once again have these coalitions, running your Johannesburg, your Tshwane, your Ekurhuleni, and your Nelson Mandela Bay. Just your thoughts to frame this quick conversation around, just your thoughts around these coalitions and what they have done to the body politic broadly, but more specifically to the running of these metropolitan areas.
Thank you very much for having me. I think it is becoming increasingly clear that the days of one dominant party are over. And as a result of that, we are going to see more and more hung councils in these elections. In the last election, I was reminded that in fact we had about 33 hung councils. Thus far, and then we still have a long way to go. We've got almost 32 that are destined.
Like 37 to be more precise in the 2016. 2027.
Yeah. So now, if you have in that kind of a situation, it means that we're going to have to find a way of managing those hung municipalities. But I think the bigger problem also here is that what you are seeing here happening at the municipal level, it is likely to happen also at the provincial level in 2024. So now if you leave this loose arrangement that we have had, it means it is going to be impacting on provincial governments as well in 2024. And then the likelihood also even at the national level is that there is a possibility that you will not actually have one dominant political party, even at the national level. That one party that needs to govern would have to require the assistance of others. Now,
I know for a fact that, there are conversations, that are happening around how these coalitions can best be managed. And it's probably going to take a while to get to a point where you have actually a very strict rule. So by and large, political parties are still going to take the lead in, negotiating what actually happens after this election. But I know for a fact that there are attempts being made to get at least some of the most basic rules in place, some do's and don'ts, if you like, because leaving it to political parties has actually been disastrous, because they only look after themselves without giving a damn about the consequences for the people in those metropolitan areas. The economies of these metropolitan areas, I mean, you've seen some of them being downgraded, which means that, they can't do the best that a metropolitan municipality can actually do in the best interest of their citizens. Just your thoughts around some of the possibilities in terms of guidelines that can be put in place to try, or at least to begin to regulate these coalitions.
Well, my view is that the current relationship that we have amongst political parties that are in a coalition arrangement, it's almost what I described as fat and said. In other words, the relationship that is very, very loose, no principle, that is based on instantaneous gratification. So in order for us to be able to deal with this particular aspect, I'm suggesting that we must have a structure almost similar to CCMA to regulate those political parties, to make sure that political parties that enter into a relationship, they deposit an agreement. It must be difficult for them to get out of that agreement, and that agreement must also include a deadlock breaking mechanism, so that when there are difficulties in a relationship, then they resort to the mechanisms that are there in law. Like, for instance, in the CCMA case, there is a process of conciliation, and then after conciliation is arbitration. And then after arbitration, a party that is still disaffected by the decision of the partner can still go to the electoral court. So we've got to find a way and mechanism through which we can actually have this regulation of coalitions. The current arrangement, it's unsustainable. Yes, in the interim, it is possible that the political parties are already having conversation about how they can make the relationship work. But in the long run, in order for people, constituencies that these political parties are representing to benefit, it means the political parties must subject themselves to an arrangement where there is a regulation of all these relationships that are going to be emerging out of this municipal elections.
And it is indeed about putting people first, because as a direct consequence, it must be said, of the actions of politicians, you have a situation now that pundits are actually attributing to how these coalitions have been, put together and how they have been run, as a direct result of which you have people now reluctant to even go and exercise their democratic right to vote, which, of course, in certain instances, gets to affect the credibility and the integrity of the very election we are talking about today. Of course, this conversation is going to continue. We will later on bring you even more insights as to what it is that is being contemplated and planned to try and even legislate around this issue. That I will bring you a little later on. For now, though, we're going to go back to the floor, and that is where my colleague, Francis Head, is standing.